Hey everybody, BTO Pro here. Today I'm going to highlight what happened in the last major refactor. So I refactored the way that we pull in different media sources into Hax. Whenever I've done these videos previously, I have this Hax source tag and I have to pull together these details. So that doesn't exist anymore, although the details still get pulled together. So I'm going to pull latest into my local on this machine. See a substantial amount of changes. Yeah, that was a big one. Basically, I took two elements that were doing a ton of lifting on their own and refactored them into about 8. So it was a fun yesterday. But now this file that just had all that logic in it is gone. You actually see Hax Manager now has nothing in it. It's pretty sick. So what is happening is that to replace it, there's a Hax store tag. There has been. But the Hax store tag is actually now able to call this thing called App Store. Now you can still supply that JSON array of data into something called Hax App instead of Hax source from before. But now we can support loading off of a JSON feed. So imagine if you had an app store, not that we're working on one, but if you theoretically had a web service that just delivered to you all of these credential information, that as that web service would add more and more apps to it, perhaps Dailymotion and then YouTube and then Vimeo and whatever else these other apps were, whether they were custom or they were silly or they were NASA or Unsplash or whatever, that you could basically build out your own integrations, basically supplying, key credential information to pre-established things that you can talk to, but that you can manage all those integrations from one place, but deploy them in many. So what this ends up netting us through this refactor is, for one, it'll be faster to access these. So this shouldn't look that different from previously, and it won't yet. But if I hit YouTube, that immediately should look differently. So I was able to return videos just by hitting this source. So once it switches kind of its internals to what it's talking to, it'll pull information. The next thing is see how there's all this other information about it. What is Elms LN, and why is this not different from blah blah blah. So if I select this video now, it's Hax is now able to wire more than just source fields for input. So the different elements can respond to multiple bindings for input from different data sources. So to illustrate that, that's wiring 2 fields into the same one. Let's do a image-based source. So let's do NASA. Again, NASA loading things very quickly from there. Let's search for the moon, as we have in other things. And then I'm going to hit this one to the moon. You'll see that the caption, alt text, and sometimes citation, depending on if it has an author, will all just get automatically populated based on the data that came across from the feed there. So, started hooking up all these different ones. Pixabay, can search for, like searching for the moon for some reason. There we go. So there's the moon. And again, you can see wired into multiple fields, image from Pixabay. That one doesn't have a citation with it either. We could hit Vimeo, and Vimeo will do kind of its own little latest. It's interesting to see that the CDN is faster, significantly faster for some sources than others. So, I can search for Mario Kart, pull in Mario Kart, again, populating multiple things off the bat. But here's the big one with this change. So, I can hit Dailymotion, I can hit these different sources, search for Drupal, I know that's safe, cool. But part of the refactor, we aren't just delivering a search field. What this is actually doing is the API wiring for the App Store is bringing along how do you search that thing on the other side. So Flickr, let's search for Drupal. Right, so we've got some images from Flickr. Cool, so we can pick this dude working at a software development firm. I can populate that across. I could go into here and say, actually, I just want things that are public domain. And so these are things on Flickr that are Drupal that are marked public domain. You can also do, let's do restricted. I don't know what that would do, why you would mark that restricted, but I could change the safety of the search results, which doesn't seem to be taken into account too much with Flickr. But all right, so let's pull in from that source. So now I know that this image is marked public domain because that's what it came across in the API. If I want CC0, there we go. There's CC0 images. Again, this wiring is actually in the information that expresses the API itself. So, not to get too detailed with it, but you can see details. This is what defines the structure of that card. So the fact that it says Flickr is because it says Flickr here and it's pink and it has that icon. You can see how we talk to Flickr via the API. We hit a REST endpoint here. And then where we get into search results, you see it's kind of, okay, browse that, but how do I actually search it? So this is actually now able to interpret JSON schema. So text is the property in the URL wiring, but it should say search and it should be input type string, and that's why you get that field there. Safe search, on the other hand, is a string, but you can define a custom component, in this case, a drop-down -select field, whose value is stored in the value property and whose slotted content should be these values. And so using this, you can see there's text, safe search, and license. That's what makes these three show up here. All of the, updating the request of the API correctly, that just happens at this point. So as another example, I can hit Jiffy and SpongeBob should be relatively safe. There we go. SpongeBob. And then I could set the rating to Y instead of G. I don't know why the burger munching one is G instead of Y, but apparently you can't munch on all those burgers if you're the youth. I could do, different language search. I could pull that in. You can see we get the caption, SpongeBob SquarePants, Hungry Burger GIF by SpongeBob SquarePants. So a little bit of citation information even on this one to say this is SpongeBob SquarePants. And then I can insert Patrick eating 1,000,000 cheeseburgers. It's a solid GIF there. So that is part of what we end up netting with this fairly substantial refactoring. So we can hit endpoints for data, so we can start loading these in off of an API call, which should get very interesting. The next thing I'm going to work on is pagination. So we need to get the pager based on what the API has sent across as the structure of the pager. That is a really hard problem to tackle, and I've started to at least map the different types of pagination that things can have. I have to boil them down to something that'll tell me where I am and where I could go, basically. But there's 4 different structures for doing so that I've identified. This is another aspect of the new API's flexibility. We had result mapping before, and we'd say, hey, the information from Flickr is an image, so you should find gizmos that have to do with images. And that you can look in the API in photos.photo, so that's where your results are. But then I've split out previewing an element from what the actual gizmo wiring is. And so the preview, if I go back to Flickr, search for Drupal again, the preview is just for building this card. However, the gizmo and how it does its wiring after the fact can be built on different values. So as a simple example, the preview image should be a small image like a thumbnail versus the source that I'm referencing for this image that it locates is actually large. The alt text can be derived from description _ content. That's a weird value for that. But so the gizmo mapping has a couple different values that you can use, and they can vary, pretty drastically. So, for example, Dailymotion can send me across a title, description, source, alt data, and caption data, and then it's on the onus is on the element itself as to what the heck to do with that. So, in the case of like a video player tag, the video player is then going to have binding to. Let's go to the actual source, shall we? going to have binding to multiple properties in Hax. So then we can see in our, here we go, in our handle thing for Gizmo. So this is now on the web component side, you know, your component that is integrating with Hax and exposing like, hey, this is how you can talk to me. It's saying, hey, my type of Gizmo that I am is a video. And if you get a source, map it to my source property. If you get a title, map it to my caption. If you get a caption, map it to my caption. If you get a description, match it to my caption. And if you get a color, match it to my primary color. And so this allows us to set up kind of this like lazy wiring, if you will, that you almost have the ways you can plug into this element, you know, and the element can work by itself. It doesn't, you know, it's just this JSON blob and an event bubbling up. So if you use it anywhere else, then who cares? But it knows how to talk to it in these different ways. So now for a video, it doesn't make a ton of sense, but for something like a content-based tag, if it had multiple ways of wiring input into it, you don't know what the source of that information is. And the cool thing is you don't really need to know. Wherever this, you know, part of the array's keys mesh with what we saw coming across from the App Store, as far as, you know, your result map, whatever those mesh with these keys, right? This is how we end up wiring. If you think of wiring from the API into the Gizmo definitions, and then this lets us go from the Gizmo definitions into this element. And so the two don't have to have any knowledge of each other than that, hey, there's, you know, these like 6 standard things that we know how to handle and output. So that is kind of the state of where Hax is, and the Hax demo. We've really been focusing on these media sources and some little edges, you know, things around the edges. Another thing I added into this is a fancy quote. So I took a card that we had worked on. This was one of the first elements we made. Fame is a vapor. And I wanted to say, well, what does this look like if I wire it up to Hax? Mark Twain. Okay. So I could do glyph decoration on it. I could change the color of it. And you should see, it took me a while to get that to work. I should see it flips the text color. So if you've seen this element before, this element used to allow you to do text color and background color independent of one another. Now you don't get to adjust the text color. It's doing that dynamically based on what the background is. Also, this is illustrating that I got select fields working, which is big for some of our JSON schema mapping. So now that I have select levels of input, I can map to a set number of values in my Hax element, or the Hax definition for an element. So we're going to insert that in the DOM, and now we have our little fame is a vapor quote, which I can then say this is outset, which lets it expand out of the current boundary. I can turn off the glyph decorator, and I can adjust the background to be light. It does all those, or I can jump back to here. So that's kind of your state of Hax. Next, I'm going to be working on Pagination. As I said, I'll also be presenting on this at Drupal Camp New Jersey coming up very soon. So I'll probably be taking a break from videos for a bit to just do and implement